Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're taking on your questions about learning English. You've shared some really interesting thoughts about grammar and its role in learning.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a hot topic. Lots of English language learners wonder about that.
Right. And it's interesting. The research you sent me suggests that focusing less on perfect grammar could be the key to speaking better and faster.
It sounds a little counterintuitive at first, but the sources all point to the idea that it's more about effective communication.
Exactly. Think about it. I bet you've talked to people who don't speak perfect English, but they probably got their meaning across right.
Precisely. One of the sources even gave this example. Yesterday, I go to the market. Grammatically incorrect, sure, but in a real conversation, we understand it.
Totally. And that actually highlights something the sources kept bringing up, this trap of perfectionism that so many learners fall into.
It's this fear of making mistakes, and it really holds people back.
Right.
One source talked about a student named Maria. She was so terrified of making grammar mistakes that she wouldn't speak at all.
Wow, I can totally relate to that feeling. What happened to her? Did she overcome that fear?
Her teacher really helped her shift her focus.
Oh, that's good.
It became less about perfect grammar and more about just getting her ideas out there.
Yeah.
Encouraged her to speak, even if it meant making mistakes. And you know what? That's when she really started making progress.
That's awesome. It makes you remember what language is really all about, right? It's about connecting with others, sharing experiences, building relationships, not just about perfect grammar.
Absolutely. And honestly, think about it. Even native English speakers make grammar mistakes all the time. Language is constantly evolving. It's adaptable.
Right. One of the articles even talked about a tourist asking for directions in broken English, but they got where they needed to go.
Exactly. It just proves that we often overthink the importance of perfect grammar in everyday communication.
I know, it's easy to get caught up in the rules. But what really blew my mind was this research from the British Council. They found that learners who focus on speaking improve 43% faster than those who focus on grammar studies.
That's a huge difference, and there's some really interesting reasons behind that statistic.
Okay, so spill the tea. Tell me why that is.
Well, first of all, when you speak, you build confidence. The more you do it, the more comfortable you get. You also start to notice grammar patterns naturally, just through using the language.
So it's kind of like learning by doing, right? As opposed to just passively studying rules.
Exactly. One source even suggested starting with a really basic phrase like, yesterday I eat food. Very good. It might not be grammatically perfect, but it gets the idea across.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm noticing that all these sources, they all seem to focus on practical strategies rather than theoretical rules.
Right. They're all about making language learning more accessible and effective.
I like that. So what other practical tips did they recommend for prioritizing communication?
They all emphasized starting small, using keywords, learning phrases, and speaking.
Those tips sound great in theory. Can we break them down a bit more? I want to make sure our listeners can really apply them.
Definitely. Let's start with starting small. Instead of getting overwhelmed with these huge, complex sentences, focus on short phrases to express simple ideas.
Give me an example of what those phrases might look like.
Oh, easy. Things like, I like coffee, or where is the hotel? Or even just, today is sunny, I am happy.
Okay, I see. It's about building a foundation. So what about using keywords? What does that involve?
Basically, it's about conveying your main idea without getting caught up in perfect grammar or sentence structure. Like, imagine you're asking for directions. Instead of saying, excuse me, could you please tell me where the supermarket is located? You could just say, supermarket, where?
That sounds almost rude when you put it like that.
It might seem that way out of context, but in a real-life situation, people would get what you mean. It gets the point across.
Right, so it's about being resourceful, even if your English is limited. I like that. What about learning phrases?
Yeah, that's a powerful one. It's about learning chunks of language you can use in different conversations. Like, excuse me, can you help me? Or, how much does this cost?
I think we all use those kinds of phrases all the time, right?
Exactly. And by doing that, you're naturally absorbing grammar patterns without even realizing it.
It's like learning by osmosis.
Yep.
Cool. So what about the last tip? Speaking every day.
Yes, that's the big one. And it's where a lot of learners get stuck.
I know, it can be hard to find opportunities to practice speaking.
The sources had some great ideas, though.
Like what?
You could find a language partner, join a conversation group, or even just talk to yourself.
Talking to yourself. Maybe I'll try that later.
Hey, whatever works. The main thing is to just get those vocal cords moving and make those sounds.
I think we've all been there. One of your sources talked about a guy named Ahmed who was really scared to speak at first, but he started by just saying one sentence in English every day.
Right. And eventually he worked his way up to longer sentences and then full conversations.
That's amazing. It really shows that even small, consistent effort can make a big difference.
It absolutely does. And it kind of brings us back to that main point we've been discussing, the importance of shifting your focus from perfect grammar to just communicating.
Right. It's about progress, not perfection.
Yeah.
And embracing the journey, even if you make mistakes along the way.
Exactly. And that's where the real learning happens.
So with all that in mind, let's take a closer look at this idea of how our perception of grammar might actually be holding us back.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
One source talked about how we tend to think of grammar as this really rigid set of rules that you absolutely have to master before you can even start speaking.
Yeah, like this huge hurdle you have to overcome.
Right, and it can feel really intimidating. But the source challenged that idea and suggested that we try to view grammar in a more fluid way.
So instead of a set of unbreakable rules, maybe it's more like a set of guidelines.
Exactly. And I think it takes the pressure off a lot.
It does. You can start to see grammar as more of a partner in communication, not an enemy you have to fight with.
That's a good way to put it.
I read something interesting recently about how different cultures approach language learning. And it seems like in some cultures, there's much more emphasis on communication and fluency, even if you make some grammar mistakes along the way.
Oh, really? I hadn't thought about that. It makes sense, though.
And people from those cultures often pick up new languages more quickly. It makes you wonder if we in the English learning world have maybe been giving grammar a little too much power.
Maybe it is time to loosen our grip on the rules a little bit and just focus on connecting with each other and expressing ourselves.
I think so. It's about finding that balance.
And after all this, I think our listeners might be feeling a little more empowered to do just that.
I hope so.
Because ultimately, it's all about communication, connecting with others, sharing experiences, building relationships, and expressing yourself authentically, even if it's not perfect.
Beautifully said. And you know what? As we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, it strikes me how much depth there is to this seemingly simple topic of grammar.
It's true. We've gone from fear and anxiety to practical tips and new perspectives, and there's still so much more to explore.
That's what makes these deep dives so much fun.
Our listeners are definitely walking away with a fresh perspective on grammar and its role in learning English. But before we get into that, I want to touch on one more point from your research that really stood out to me.
Oh, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Okay, so one of the sources talked about how our perception of grammar can actually create a barrier to learning. It said that we often view grammar as this rigid set of rules that we have to master perfectly, which can be very intimidating and make us afraid to speak.
That can definitely lead to anxiety and make it feel like an insurmountable hurdle before you can even start speaking.
Exactly. The source challenged this perception and suggested we think of grammar in a more fluid and adaptable way.
So instead of seeing it as this set of unbreakable laws, we should think of it more as a set of guidelines that we can adapt based on the context.
You got it. And I think that can take so much of the pressure off. It allows us to be more creative and playful with language.
That's a great way to put it. It's like viewing grammar as a partner in communication instead of an adversary.
This is such a crucial point to highlight for our listeners. Shifting your mindset about grammar can create new opportunities for learning and fluency.
Absolutely. It makes me think of some research I read recently about how different cultures approach learning languages.
Tell me more. I always find it interesting to compare different cultural perspectives.
In some cultures, they place a stronger emphasis on communication and fluency, even if it means making grammatical mistakes along the way. And the interesting thing is that people from these cultures tend to learn new languages more quickly and effortlessly.
That is super interesting. It seems like our cultural background can really affect how we approach learning languages.
Totally. It makes you wonder if we, the English learning world, have given grammar too much power.
Maybe it's time to loosen up a little on those rules and focus more on being able to communicate.
I agree. And after this deep dive, I have a feeling our listener will feel more confident in doing just that.
I hope so. At the end of the day, it's about connecting, communicating, and expressing yourself with confidence. Don't worry so much about being perfect.
That's a great point to end on. As we wrap up this part of the discussion, I'm struck by how many layers there are to the topic of grammar.
It's true. We started with these anxiety-inducing rules, but discovered all these amazing tools and strategies. It's been quite the journey.
It has. And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. We take a familiar concept, look at it from different angles, and end up with a deeper understanding of how it works.
Could have said it better myself. Our listeners are walking away with a whole new perspective on grammar and how it plays a role in learning English. It's crazy how we started talking about grammar, and now we're talking about all these different cultures and how they learn languages. You were saying something about that before.
Oh, yeah, it's super fascinating. I was saying that in some cultures, they put more emphasis on fluency, like getting your message across, even if your grammar isn't perfect.
That sounds way more relaxed than the way we usually learn grammar.
Right. And the cool thing is, people from those cultures tend to learn languages faster.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
That makes you think maybe our focus on grammar rules is actually kind of holding us back.
Yeah, maybe. It's worth thinking about. Maybe we should see grammar as more of a tool, you know, to help us communicate, not as a set of strict rules we have to follow perfectly.
So like a helpful guide instead of a super strict teacher.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance.
Yeah.
Grammar is important, but it shouldn't stop you from speaking and enjoying the language.
That's such a good point. Don't let perfect grammar get in the way of actually using English.
Totally. And remember, even native English speakers make mistakes sometimes. The important thing is to keep practicing and having fun with it.
I love that. Okay, so enough about mindset. Let's get practical. What are some things our listeners can do, like today, to shift their focus from perfection to communication?
But one of the most important things is to find ways to speak English as much as you can, even if it's just for a few minutes every day.
I know. Easier said than done, right?
It can be tough. But the articles you shared had some great tips, like finding a language partner, joining a conversation group, or even recording yourself speaking.
Speaking of recording yourself, did you ever try talking to yourself in English? I used to do that when I was learning. It helped me get comfortable with the sounds.
Yeah, that's totally valid. Might feel a little weird at first, but hey, if it works, it works. The main thing is to just get speaking, even if you make mistakes. The more you do it, the more confident you'll become.
And the more fun it is, too. It's like this weight is lifted off your shoulders when you stop worrying about being perfect all the time.
Totally. It's so freeing, and it opens up all these new possibilities for learning and growing.
Okay, so we talked about mindset, and now we've got some practical tips. But what about specific strategies for getting better at communicating in English?
Let's talk about those. Remember those tips we were talking about before? Starting small, using keywords, and learning common phrases.
Yeah, those were great. Super practical. Tell our listeners how they can actually use them.
Okay, so starting small is all about keeping things simple. Focus on short, easy phrases to express your ideas. Don't worry about making super complicated sentences right away.
Can you give me a few examples?
Sure. Think of phrases like, I like coffee, or where's the hotel? Or even something as basic as, today is sunny, I am happy. Simple but effective.
Got it. So you build a strong foundation first. What about using keywords?
That's about getting your main point across without worrying too much about grammar rules. Like, imagine you're in a restaurant and you want to order a pizza. Instead of saying something super formal, you could just point to the menu and say, pepperoni pizza, please.
Oh, I see. You use those key words, pepperoni and pizza, to make sure they understand what you want.
Exactly. You're being resourceful with the language you have.
I like that. What about the learning phrases tip? I always found that helpful. Things like, excuse me, can you help me? Or, how much does this cost? Those phrases are lifesavers.
For real. And the cool thing is, by learning these phrases, you're also absorbing the grammar that goes with them, without even trying too hard.
It's like you're learning grammar by accident.
Exactly. It takes away all the pressure and makes it so much more natural.
So instead of getting stuck on all the technical details, you're actually using the language in a real way.
That's the key.
Yeah.
And that's what helps you become more fluent and confident.
Okay, so we've got starting small, using keywords, and learning phrases. What's the final piece of the puzzle?
This one is crucial. Speak every single day, even if it's just for a few minutes. Find opportunities to use English out loud.
I know. That's the hard part for so many people. It can be tough to find those opportunities when you're not surrounded by English speakers.
I get it. It can be tricky. But think outside the box. You could watch movies or TV shows in English and repeat the phrases. Or try shadowing, where you listen to a podcast and try to speak along with the host.
Those are great ideas. They sound fun, too. It's about making English a part of your daily life, not just something you study.
Exactly. It shouldn't feel like a chore.
And remember, Ahmed, that learner who started with just one sentence a day, he made so much progress just by doing a little bit every day.
His story is so inspiring. He gradually built up to longer sentences, then conversations, and his grammar even improved just from speaking more.
It's amazing how a little bit of effort every day can add up to so much.
It really is. And it reminds us that you don't have to be perfect right away. You just have to start.
And that brings us back to that big idea we've been talking about, shifting your focus away from perfection and towards communication.
Exactly. It's about enjoying the process, making mistakes, and learning along the way.
And the more you speak, the more comfortable you become, and your fluency grows faster too.
It's this amazing cycle. And when you combine that consistent practice with the strategies we discussed, starting small, using keywords, learning common phrases, it really speeds up your progress.
Honestly, I'm feeling super inspired after this conversation. It's like we've uncovered this secret to language learning, or at least a new way of looking at it.
It's definitely a powerful shift in perspective. And I think our listeners are walking away with a ton of useful tips and more confidence to learn English.
That's the goal, because in the end, it's about connecting with people, sharing experiences, and expressing yourself with confidence, even if you make a few mistakes along the way.
So true. As we're wrapping up this part of our deep dives, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What are some of the key takeaways that have really resonated with you today?
I feel like my head is spinning with all this new stuff about language learning. It's amazing how much we've learned just by looking at this one topic from all these angles.
It's been an interesting journey, for sure. And we've really challenged some of those traditional ideas about grammar, haven't we?
Absolutely. And you asked about my key takeaways. Well, honestly, the biggest one for me is this idea of shifting the focus from perfect grammar to just communicating confidently. It's like this huge relief.
It is freeing, isn't it? And it's not about ignoring grammar completely, right? It's more about using it as a tool that helps you communicate better.
I love that way of looking at it. And you know, it's funny, it actually lines up perfectly with that research we talked about earlier. The one about how learners who prioritize speaking end up improving way faster than those who just study grammar rules.
It all connects, doesn't it? It shows you that actually using the language, even if you make mistakes, is the most important thing.
Totally. And I also love how we didn't just talk about all this theoretically. We actually gave our listeners real practical tips they can start using today.
Exactly. Things like starting small, using keywords, learning common phrases, those are all things anyone can do.
Okay, so listeners, here's a challenge for you. What's one small step you can take today to start speaking more English?
Maybe you could try having a short conversation with a language exchange partner or a tutor, or even just record yourself speaking for a couple of minutes. You'd be surprised how much it helps.
Even if you're just visiting an English-speaking country, try ordering your coffee in English. Every little bit counts.
That's the spirit. It's all about pushing yourself a little bit outside your comfort zone and celebrating those small wins.
And remember, it's totally okay to mess up. In fact, mistakes are proof that you're learning and getting better.
Totally agree. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. They're all part of the process.
It's funny how we started by looking at your research about grammar and somehow ended up talking about different cultures and mindset shifts and all these practical tips.
It just goes to show you how interconnected everything is, right? We started with one question and uncovered a whole world of ideas.
And I think that's a great metaphor for the whole learning process, actually. It's not just a straight line from A to B. It's more like this big adventure full of twists and turns.
Exactly. And who knows what our listeners will discover on their own learning adventures.
That's the exciting part. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave everyone with a sense of excitement and possibility. Remember, learning English is not just about rules and textbooks. It's about connecting with people, exploring different cultures, and being able to express yourself in a genuine way.
And don't forget to have fun along the way. There will be challenges, of course, but there will also be lots of laughs and those aha moments that make it all worthwhile.
So listeners, embrace the journey, celebrate those little wins, and never stop exploring the amazing world of English.
Happy learning, everyone.
Happy learning!